Welcome, everyone, to a new episode of the History Shorts Conversations. I'm Peter Zablocki, your host. Today, I am honored to be joined by one of the world's foremost historians of modern international relations, Professor Odd Arne Westad. Arne is a professor of history at Yale University and the author of several landmark books, including the acclaimed The Cold War, A World History. His latest book, The Coming Storm: Power, Conflict, and Warnings from History, is a timely and urgent warning about the rising dangers of great power competition in our multipolar world. Today, we'll discuss the striking parallels with the period before 1914, the major flashpoints that worry him most, the impact of new technologies on warfare, and what practical steps we can take to avoid a catastrophe. I hope you guys enjoy. Arnie, welcome to the show.
It's great to be with you, Peter.
So this is perhaps a silly question to ask, considering, if we could just put on NPR in the news, but why this book and why now?
So I've done a few books, as you know, and I don't think I ever, probably purely by accident, done a book that is more to say for the immediate moment that we're in than this one. So I started writing it before a number of the disasters that have befallen of us of late actually happened. And then to my horror, I found that some of the stuff I'm writing about get increasingly relevant, which is, of course, not what I was hoping for. I mean, I always wanted a book to sell well, but not for these kinds of reasons. So this is a book that tries to deal with warnings from history, looking at the world in the early 20th century, what went terribly wrong, how we ended up with two world wars and a global depression and totalitarianisms and anti-Semitism and all of this kind of stuff that basically destroyed the 20th century, and how we can avoid making some of those same mistakes today that unleashed those sets of disasters. So that's the reason I wrote the book, and the way I did it is very much in a conversation with ordinary readers who want to talk about this. It's not a history book. It's a book about warnings for our own time, which is, I hope, informed by some of the stuff that I've been doing as an historian.
So there's so many places in history you could have gone to find these parallels, but yet you found the most striking parallels in one particular period in history. Can you explain, that reasoning and maybe how you went about finding and concentrating on that period?
Because it's so strikingly similar to our own time. I mean, not on everything. I mean, of course, there are differences as well. But if we think about the comparisons that are often made today, I mean, to the Cold War or even to the mid 20th century, those seem to me, in terms of structure, to be much more far-fetched in terms of what is the situation today than if we look at what was the case about 100 years ago. Same kind of stuff. Preoccupation with a globalization process that seemed to have failed a lot of people in a lot of different countries. A preoccupation with a relationship between world powers that's changing very, very quickly. A set of technological changes that are happening so fast that people are not able to catch up. And then this fear that comes out of a very unstable kind of world when no one knows what's going to come next, right? This is nothing of the stability of the Cold War or even the period just after it. It's very, very similar to the world at the beginning of the 20th century, which unfortunately was the world that produced these kinds of disasters that we just talked about.
Can you think of one striking similarity that as you're doing this research, you're like, oh, whoa, yeah, this definitely makes sense in today's world by looking at the past?
I think there are many of them. I mean, the one that really struck me when I started looking at this and that stood out is probably this preoccupation that you have within the leading powers of the time, just like now, with how globalization has failed them. I mean, it's doubly ironic because these are the countries, 100 years ago, Britain, France, etc., who were the ones who had put the system together, just like the United States, to a large extent, has put together the system that we are seeing at the moment. And yet, it's these countries, or at least a significant portion of the population in these countries, who decide that these systems that their countries have put in place are no longer serving their interests. Jobs are going overseas. There is a huge problem with understanding what is going on, what is befalling sort of ordinary people who thought of themselves as having a pretty solid kind of existence. The fear that other countries are stealing technological secrets and making use of it against the more powerful countries in question. All of that is so. I mean, you could take a newspaper from 1913 on these kinds of issues, and you just change the names of the countries, and you could make it sound just like today.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because you said changed countries. You say one of the most dangerous flashpoints today is Taiwan, and you kind of compare that to us, Bosnia, Belgium, right? Can you explain that concept?
So Taiwan is certainly among, if not the most dangerous conflict that we are looking at the moment, because it involves the two most powerful great powers in today's system, the United States and China, in a very direct kind of way, and also because it's so intractable. I mean, it's proven itself so difficult to deal with over time, and it has some of those same um, measures to it as you found in the with many of the key conflicts in the early 20th century. Same nationalist aspects to it that Bosnia had back then. Bosnia was all about nation and nationalism and unification along national lines, all that kind of stuff. Territorially, very similar to Alsace-Lorraine, which was one of the reasons why the First World War broke out. Constant back and forth between Germany and France over who should control that territory. And then finally, some of the strategic implications of Belgium. But that's the part that even many historically minded people do not pick up on. So it was the German invasion of Belgium in the summer of 1914 that made this war, the First World War, into a world war by pulling Britain into the war. So they chose, for reasons that had to do with their own military strategic thinking, to attack the only country in Europe with which Britain actually had some kind of defense arrangement. Right? And they did it for quite good military reasons. They wanted to be in Paris within a week and knock France out of the war, and therefore they had to move through Belgium, not thinking about the consequences of doing just that. So those are some of the similarities with those kinds of crises. And I must say, now if you add other ongoing crises like Iran and Ukraine into it, the mix to me seems to be very, very similar.
Yeah, and you mentioned this idea in the book that Cold War was very predictable in a sense, right? And now we're shifting to a more fragile, multipolar system with increased risk, you might say, right? How does that increase the risk of some form of a great power conflict?
Just for the reasons that you said, Peter, it's less predictable. It's much more complex, much more complicated in terms of finding solutions. You have more countries that have to be involved in some way in order to find some kind of arrangement. I mean, think about Russia and Ukraine, at the moment. Um, it's just more difficult. I mean, I often find that striking with some of those countries who are saying, you know, like Russia and China, we really want a multipolar world. We desire a multipolar world. Well, they have to be careful what they wish for, because a multipolar world is much more difficult to handle in many ways, maybe especially from the perspectives of the people, in states that are emerging powers than what they are within the establishment powers, right? So that's part of the problem is this difficulty in foreseeing where we are going, because we have a world that is much more complex than anything that we have known in our lifetimes.
And talking about complexity in the world, you also talk about how modern technology, if you put all that into the mix, right, that makes it even more dangerous in a sense, right? Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
So that's another similarity, Peter, with what you had in the early 20th century, was this sense that technological change was, if not out of control, at least moving extremely rapidly and in ways that it was very hard for ordinary people to understand. So that instead of thinking about inventions back then, telephone, telegraph, uh, railways and steamships and aircraft and all that kind of stuff, as something that would serve people, in their daily existence. People, as these tensions grew, became very fearful that these new technologies could have military uses that could be turned against them. Um, and that's actually, when I started writing this book, this was one of the things that I found to be most striking, was how many parallels there are between how people started to think about that kind of or transformation in the pre-World War One era, and what we are looking at first with, computing power and communications, and then with AI and whatever comes next, quantum computing, in our own time, right? It doesn't mean that people feel that they are leading better and safer lives. It feels, in many cases at least, it leads to a world that people find is much harder to handle and harder to understand.
Yeah, I always, you see this in movies all the time, but this idea that they could send a virus, we
Yeah,
don't ever even need weapons in the traditional sense. You don't, or you could just send a virus and cripple an entire infrastructure of a nation, which is, and Taiwan with the semiconductors, this idea like now you start adding that to the equation. So it's not just, oh, we're trying to talk about preserving Taiwan's independence. Now it's really who controls the technology that's coming from it.
exactly. I mean, this is part of the problem, that we have created a world that is so complex, so hard to foretell in terms of directions, especially with regard to technology. Who has the knowledge? How it can spread? What are the focus points for future development? That it leads to all these kinds of sometimes quite irrational, but still very strongly held fears about what the future could bring. I mean, it's striking to see how in the years before 1914, maybe especially in a country like Great Britain, which was the most powerful of the many great powers before the First World War, there was this incredible fear that the Germans or others, including the United States, could discover some kind of technological advance that would immediately skew the whole international system to their advantage and to Britain's disadvantage. And they did this even if they knew that on many of these things, the Brits were doing pretty well, right? So it doesn't really have much to do with that reality at all. And you see exactly the same kind of thing happening now within many powers, but I would say especially in many ways within the United States.
You kind of talk about in the book this idea that the United States is similar to what Britain was at the time. It's a big power, but it's not at its peak, you might say, right? So, and then you talk about the fact that Russia obviously is no longer what it once was, maybe 30 years ago. Um, let's can maybe talk about the roles and ambitions of these major players today. Can we maybe touch upon that a little bit?
Yeah. So I think just like 100 years ago, you have what you could call establishment powers and you have rising powers. And the biggest establishment power, of course, is the United States, that has more or less spent the 20th century attempting to remake the world in its image. Not always successfully, but have had some pretty good goals at that. And then on the other hand, you have countries like China coming up, India, you have Russia, which is very different because, as you say, it used to be more powerful than what it is now, but it's still a great power, feeling that it's been chucked out, of good company, that it no longer has the positions that it had before. I mean, you could call them, wannabe powers, but powerful enough, to have a very significant impact on the global system. Now, it's not given, and that's one of the points in the book, as you will know, Peter, that there is necessarily some kind of conflict, never mind war, among these various powers. But it's clear that in that kind of situation, tensions will be rising, that they're quite, this is a difficult kind of environment, different kind of setting, right? And it won't be any easier as there are more great powers coming to the fore. I mean, I mentioned India. India is one of those that is really positioned over the next generation because of its demographic patterns, because of its economic growth, because of its location, to become a really significant great power with its own interests, right? We don't think much about that today. We probably ought to think about it a heck of a lot more than what we actually do. So again, it's about these transformations and differences in interest, differences in terms of where people want to go that are not necessarily disastrous, but we have to take them into consideration. In a way, we really didn't have to when we think about a Cold War kind of world or a post Cold War, um, uh, you know, US predominant kind of world.
I think of this idea that if we look at a textbook about the history of World War One, and it's almost like you're reading, there's a chapter called "Causes of Long Term, Short Term, Immediate," right? And you kind of step back and you're like, oh, if this only changed here, if this only changed here, if you could look at today's time, right? What are perhaps some things that we could do or the world leaders could do to alleviate some of these, maybe take a different road towards where we're going potentially?
No, I mean, this is very much the spirit in which the book is written. I mean, it's not just about understanding what went wrong, it's also about what we can do about that today in order to avoid making some of the same mistakes. I mean, one that really stands out to me is trying to deal with ongoing wars and conflicts before they take on a kind of character that would point in the direction of the disasters that happened in the early part of the 20th century. So we have this, I mean, or at least up to recently, very recently, we had this belief that, you know, think Iran, what happens in the Middle East stays in the Middle East, right? It's terrible in that region, but it wouldn't threaten a world war. Well, I mean, when you look at the situation today with regard to the Iran conflict, or for that matter, in terms of what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening in Korea or Taiwan, I could easily foresee some kind of conflation of many of these conflicts that could lead in the direction of absolute disaster if a world-class crisis that we cannot foresee at the moment, like what happened in the summer of 1914, a terrorist act, the murders in Sarajevo, could come along that would all of a sudden, upend the apple cart. And therefore, it's important to try to deal with these ongoing wars, at least through some kind of ceasefire, while we still have the chance to do so. Right. So that's lesson number one. Lesson number two, I think, is that we have to have more of an understanding for the strategic aims of other powers. Not the issue just of communication and talking. There's a lot of talking going on, I mean, today. Just like what was the case before 1914. I mean, it's not that people didn't talk. Three of the heads of state in what became the warring countries in 1914 were cousins. The Kaiser, the Russian Tsar, the British King. They spoke often, but they spoke without any kind of real understanding of the strategic aims of others. And I feel that that's very much the situation today as well. I mean, between the United States and China, for instance, but also in other contexts. And then thirdly, I think one of the real mistakes that people made back then was this idea that by moving away from relatively open economic and financial and technological exchange, that could give your country advantages that it otherwise wouldn't have got. I think that was a mistake back then. I think it is a mistake now. Not that in itself would lead to war and an armed conflict, but because it creates the kind of atmosphere that makes those kinds of reactions more likely if something else happens that blows everything up, right? So those are the three that really stand out to me. Those are perhaps the most important, the immediate warnings. But there are many others. I mean, issues of terrorism, for instance, which we talked about briefly, issues that have to do with interactions in crisis zones, trying to make sure that things do not get to the point where you actually have the outbreak of wars. Lots of things that were similar back then to what the situation is now and that we can actually learn from.
Yeah. So if someone picks up your book and they finish reading and they're like, "Oh gosh," and they just feel so pessimistic about the world, like what hope can you give people that finish the book and they're like, "I'm just gonna pack it in, I'm just gonna stay home and never leave the house." What
The
do you
first
think?
advice I have is don't read this book late at night. It's a brief book. You can read it in about 3 hours, I think. But don't read it late at night unless you have some strong drink or something else to calm yourself down with, dependent on your taste and predilections, because it is this stuff is dangerous. We saw that repeatedly during the 20th century, and we're seeing some of the makings of the same kind of difficulties today. But it's not hopeless, right? So I wrote this book very much because I want people to pick up what they can actually do about this, and lots of things that people can do. I mean, they can emphasize, as we already talked about, the ways of interaction with other countries that genuinely promote peace. And that might sound a little bit like pie in the sky, given the kind of situation we have at the moment. It isn't. I mean, if you want to prepare for peace on a global scale, well, then you have to prepare for peace. You have to have more contacts with people from other countries. You have to think more about what kind of impact can I have in terms of what I write or what I teach or what I say, in terms of the direction of having more of a sense of compromise. Not necessarily all-out understanding about different countries. That's not the point. But having some kind of compromise that can lead to more stability. So this is about attitudes more than anything else. The final chapter, as you will have seen, is called The Case for Peace. And that's not because I'm not a pacifist. I understand that there are wars that are sometimes necessary to be fought, wars that are fought in self-defense. So it's not about that. But it's just about understanding what an unmitigated disaster great power war would be in our time. Particularly, as I said, because there are so few people around today who have experienced great power. Almost no one alive today have experienced great power war. So that's the reason why it's worth thinking through how we can move from the kind of chaotic situation we are in today, at least towards some more stability.
Arne, thank you so much for taking the time today. This was an amazing interview. I really appreciate you taking the time.
It was great speaking to you, Peter. Thank you for taking me on.